The drive to the B&B was supposed to be part of the adventure. It was me, Jess, Jack, and Tara, all buzzing with excitement. We were headed to a secluded cabin in the middle of the forest, a perfect getaway from our city lives. As we drove deeper into the woods, the GPS signal grew weaker, and we found ourselves relying on printed directions and Jack's questionable sense of direction. By the time we arrived, dusk had settled in, casting long shadows through the dense trees. The cabin looked exactly like the photos, charming and rustic, but in the dim light, it took on a more sinister appearance. The trees loomed tall and menacing, their branches like skeletal fingers against the sky. Jess fumbled with the keys, and we finally got inside. The place was cozy, with a large fireplace and wooden furniture. We unpacked quickly, eager to start a fire and relax. Tara found an old guest book on a shelf and started flipping through it. "Guys, listen to this," she said, reading out loud an entry from a few months ago. "Had a great time, but heard strange noises at night. Probably just animals, but it was creepy." We all just laughed it off. We were far from civilization, so of course, the night sound would be different. We settled in, making dinner and sharing stories around the fire. By the time we went to bed, the cabin felt almost homey. In the dead of night, I woke up to a faint, persistent scratching sound. It was coming from outside my window. My heart pounded in my chest, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a branch or some small animal. I closed my eyes, willing myself to ignore it, but then I heard it again, this time a lot louder. I slipped out of bed and tiptoed to the window. The moonlight was bright enough to cast eerie shadows, but I couldn't see anything unusual. Just as I was about to turn away, I caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow darting amongst the trees. I froze, watching, but nothing else stirred. The next morning, I told the others. Jack shrugged it off, but Jess and Tara looked uneasy. "Let's just keep the doors and windows locked tonight," Jess suggested. We all agreed, trying to shake off the lingering unease. That evening, we decided to play some board games to distract ourselves. The wind howled outside, making the cabin creak and groan. It was just like the forest was closing in on us. Around midnight, the power went out, plunging us into darkness. Jack found some candles and we huddled together, trying to stay calm. Then we heard it, a low guttural growl coming from the woods. It wasn't like an animal sound we'd ever heard. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on the gravel outside the cabin. Tara whimpered, clutching my arm. "What the hell is that?" Jack whispered, his face pale in the candlelight. The footsteps grew closer, circling the cabin. We heard scratching at the door, more insistent this time. I grabbed a fireplace poker, my hands shaking. Suddenly, the door rattled violently, as if somebody, or something, was trying to force it open. We backed away, terrified. Jess grabbed her phone to call for help, but there was no signal. We were on our own. The rattling stopped as abruptly as it had begun. We stood in tense silence, straining to hear any sounds. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, the footsteps retreated, fading into the distance. We stayed awake all night, too scared to sleep. When the morning came, we packed up and left as quickly as possible. As we drove away, I glanced back at the cabin. It stood silent and empty, but I knew we'd never forget those terrifying sounds in the night. We never spoke of it again, but the fear lingered, a chilling reminder of our weekend in the forest. Last fall, my friends and I decided to camp in the remote part of Blackwood Forest. We were seasoned campers, confident in our skill and looking for an adventure. We pitched our tents in a small clearing, surrounded by dense trees that blocked out most of the light. It felt isolated, perfect for our getaway. The first night was uneventful, filled with laughter and stories around the campfire. But on the second night, things took a turn for the worse. It started with feelings of being watched. Around midnight, we heard the first sound, a soft crunching of leaves, like footsteps. We shone our flashlights into the darkness, but saw nothing. The sound stopped as suddenly as it started. We laughed it off nervously and went back to our tents. I had just started to drift off when I heard it again, closer this time. I sat up, straining to hear. There it was, the unmistakable sound of someone or something walking around our campsite. I held my breath, my heart pounding. The steps circled our tents, moving methodically. Suddenly, my friend Mark shouted, "Who was there?" The footsteps stopped. We waited, listening. Then came the sound of something scratching against the fabric of Mark's tent. He unzipped his tent and shone his flashlight out, but there was nothing there, just the dark, silent forest. None of us slept that night. We sat together, keeping the fire burning, too scared to close our eyes. The footsteps continued, sometimes close, sometimes far, always just out of sight. Dawn finally broke, and the sound ceased. Exhausted and unnerved, we decided to pack up and leave. As we were breaking camp, I noticed something that sent chills down my spine. Around our campsite, in the soft dirt, were footprints. But these were no ordinary footprints. They were huge, almost twice the size of a human foot, with long, claw-like toes. We looked at each other, realizing whatever had been stalking us was not human. We left in a hurry, not looking back. To this day, none of us can explain what happened that night in Blackwood Forest. We've all agreed never to return, and I still get chills thinking about the silent stalker that walked circles around our camp that night. It was supposed to be a quick day hike in the Pine Barrens. I had taken the trail many times before, a well-marked out path leading to a beautiful overlook. But that day, something was different. The forest seemed unusually quiet, the air heavy with an oppressive stillness. I was about halfway to the overlook when I noticed the path ahead looked different, as if it had shifted somehow. I stopped, puzzled. The trail markers, usually bright and clear, were faded, almost invisible. I pressed on, thinking maybe it was just my imagination. A few minutes later, I came across something that stopped me cold. The path split in two. There had never been a fork here before. One path looked well worn, the other overgrown and dark. I knew I should turn back, but curiosity got the better of me, and I took the overgrown path. The forest seemed to close in around me as I walked. The trees grew denser, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the light. The air grew colder, and an eerie silence enveloped me. I felt an increasing sense of dread, but I pushed on, convinced there was some logical explanation. After what felt like an eternity, I emerged into a small clearing. In the center stood an old, twisted tree, its branches bare and gnarled. Something about the tree felt wrong, like it didn't belong in this world. I approached, feeling drawn to it. As I reached out to touch the tree, a sudden, overwhelming fear gripped me. I pulled my hand back, heart racing. The clearing felt suffocating, the silence deafening. I turned to leave, but the path was gone. Where the trail had been was now just dense forest. I tried to retrace my steps, but every direction seemed the same. The trees seemed to shift and move, trapping me in the clearing. I shouted for help, but my voice was swallowed by the forest. I was completely, utterly alone. Hours passed, or maybe it was days. Time lost all meaning. Exhausted and terrified, I sat down by the twisted tree. That's when I noticed the carvings, deep marks in the bark forming words I couldn't understand. The tree seemed to have a strange energy. In my desperation, I closed my eyes and whispered a plea for help. When I opened them, the path had reappeared. I didn't question it, I just ran. I ran until I burst out of the forest, back onto the familiar trail. I never looked back. I don't know what happened that day in the Pine Barrens. I don't want to know. I've never returned to that trail, and I warn everyone I meet to stay away from that forest. Some paths are better left unexplored. It was supposed to be a weekend of fun and adventure. My college friends and I had planned a camping trip in the Echo Forest, a place known for its dense trees and haunting beauty. We arrived on a Friday afternoon, set up our tents and spent the evening around the campfire, sharing scary stories and laughing. I woke up in the middle of the night to a soft tapping. It seemed to be coming from the outside of my tent. I lay still, holding my breath and listening. The tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. I unzipped my tent slowly, peeking out with my flashlight. To my horror, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the trees. It was tall and gaunt, with long, tangled hair and eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. The tapping was its long, bony fingers drumming against the trees. I called out to my friends, but the figure vanished as they emerged from their tents. They looked around, seeing nothing, and chalked it up to my imagination, but I knew what I saw. The next day, we explored the forest, trying to shake off the night's eerie encounter. We came across an old, abandoned cabin, half hidden by overgrown vines. Against our better judgment, we decided to investigate. The inside was a mess of decaying furniture and dust, but one thing stood out, a large, cracked mirror hanging on the wall. As we stared into the mirror, our reflections seemed off. They moved independently, delayed, and their eyes seemed to follow us with an unsettling intensity. My friend Sarah reached out to touch the mirror, and her reflection grinned, a wide, unnatural grin that sent shivers down our spines. We stumbled out the cabin, shaken. The rest of the day passed in an uneasy silence. That night, the noises returned, louder and more persistent. Whispers, taps, and the sound of something heavy dragging through the leaves. We huddled together, too scared to sleep. Around midnight, the noises stopped abruptly, and oppressive silence fell over the forest. Then we heard a growl coming from all around us. Shapes moved in the shadows, just beyond the reach of our flashlights. We decided to leave, packing up in a frantic rush. As we hurried through the dark forest, the growls followed us, growing closer and more menacing. We could see eyes glowing in the darkness, watching our every move. Just as we reached the edge of the forest, I felt a cold hand grasp my ankle. I stumbled, falling to the ground. My friends pulled me up, and we sprinted to the car, not stopping until we were miles away. The Echo Forest is a place of nightmares, and I'll never set foot there again. The things that lurk in those woods are better left undisturbed. It was a crisp autumn evening when Jenny, Mark, and their dog, Scout, set out for a weekend camping trip in the secluded Pine Hollow Forest. The forest was known for its dense pines and serene lakes, but also for its eerie quietness. Locals often spoke in the hushed tones about strange occurrences, but Jenny and Mark were seasoned campers, dismissing the stories as mere myth. They set up camp near a small, picturesque lake, the trees towering around them, creating a cocoon of tranquility. As night fell, they built a fire and settled into the cozy glow, roasting marshmallows and sharing laughter. Scout, a golden retriever with boundless energy, lay contentedly by the fire, occasionally pricking up his ears at the night sounds. Around midnight, the fire was reduced to glowing embers, and the forest was cloaked in an almost oppressive silence. Jenny and Mark retreated to their tents, Scout curling up at their feet. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and a distant hoot of an owl. Sometime in the early hours, Jenny was jolted awake by a low growl from Scout. She sat up, heart pounding, and listened. There it was again, a soft, almost imperceptible whispering, like voices carrying on the wind. She shook Mark awake, and they both listened intently, the whispers growing slightly louder, yet still indistinct. Mark unzipped the tent and shone his flashlight into the darkness, the beam cutting through the trees but revealed nothing unusual. The whispering ceased abruptly, leaving an unsettling silence. Convinced it was just the wind, they tried to go back to sleep, but a sense of unease lingered. A few hours later, Scout started barking viciously, his body tense, hand hackles raised. Jenny and Mark scrambled out of their sleeping bags, grabbing the flashlight and a camping knife. The whispering had returned, louder and more distinct. It seemed to be coming from all around them. They stepped out of their tent to find a figure standing at the edge of the campsite. The figure was tall, with an unnaturally elongated silhouette. As Mark shone the flashlight on it, the figure melted back into the shadows. The whispering stopped as suddenly as it had started. Terrified, they decided to pack up and leave immediately. They quickly dismantled their tents, constantly glancing over their shoulders. The forest seemed to close in on them, the trees casting long, sinister shadows. As they drove away, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon, Jenny looked back at the campsite. Her blood ran cold. At the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the trees, the dark figure stood, watching them leave. They never returned to Pine Hollow Forest. The chilling whispers, a mysterious figure haunted their dreams, a constant reminder of the night they narrowly escaped something truly sinister. It was the last weekend of October, and 4 friends, Tom, Sarah, Emily and Jake, decided to go camping in the remote woods of Blackwood Forest. The forest had an eerie reputation, with stories of disappearances and strange sightings, but the friends dismissed these as local folklore. They were eager for an adventure, and the idea of camping in a place with dark history added a thrill. The first night was uneventful. They set up their tents, built a campfire, and told ghost stories, laughing at each other's exaggerated tales. The air was chilly, and the moonlight filtered through the dense canopy, casting long, ghostly shadows. As the night deepened, they settled into their tents, the fire slowly dying, leaving behind glowing embers. Around midnight, a distant, chilling howl echoed through the forest. Sarah, the lightest sleeper, sat up abruptly, her heart pounding. She shook Tom awake, but he dismissed it as a wolf or a coyote. Unable to shake off the feeling of unease, Sarah lay back down, listening intently to the forest noises. Just as she was drifting back to sleep, there was a rustling sound outside their tent. She held her breath, straining to hear. The sound grew closer, accompanied by soft, almost human-like whispers. Panic surged through her. She nudged Tom again, who this time sat up and listened. The whispers were now unmistakable, too close and too distinct to be the wind. Tom grabbed a flashlight and unzipped the tent slowly, peering outside. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. Relieved, he turned back to Sarah, who was still tense and wide-eyed. He assured her it was just her imagination and zipped up the tent. The whispers stopped and silence fell once more. Tom eventually fell back to sleep, but Sarah remained vigilant, her eyes darting around the tent. An hour passed without incident, and she finally allowed herself to relax, thinking maybe Tom was right. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night. It was Emily. Tom and Sarah scrambled out their tent and rushed to their friend's tent, where Jake was already frantically unzipping it. Inside, they found Emily shaking and crying uncontrollably. She pointed to the edge of the campsite, where a tall, dark figure stood at the boundary of their flashlight, staring at them. Jake shone his flashlight towards the figure, but it vanished into the darkness before the beam could reach it. They gathered, terrified, trying to rationalize what they had just seen. Maybe it was just a prankster, they thought. or a trick of light. Deciding it was safer to stay together, they huddled around the campfire, which they stoked back to life. Hours passed and nothing else happened. As dawn approached, they packed up their gear, eager to leave the forest behind. As they hiked back to the car, they couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The oppressive silence of the forest weighed heavily on them, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. When they finally reached the safety of their vehicle, they breathed a collective sigh of relief. Driving away, they swore never to return to the Blackwood Forest. As they rounded the last bend in the road, Sarah glanced back one last time. She froze, her blood running cold. Standing at the edge of the forest, partially hidden by the trees, was the same dark figure, watching them. The forest had claimed many, and now they knew why. The legend of Blackwood Forest was real, and they had narrowly escaped becoming part of its sinister history. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and check out my other horror stories on the screen now. And until next time, sleep tight.